You think you understand what it would mean for time to end. You don't. You imagine a final moment, a last second ticking away, the universe freezing or going dark. This confidence comes from treating time as a thing that moves, something that flows, and could therefore stop. You assume time behaves like a process that can be interrupted. That assumption is not supported by how the universe is structured. It is supported only by how time feels to you. Your intuition begins with a quiet premise that time exists independently of what happens within it. Events occur in time, objects persist through time, change requires time. From this, you conclude that time could, in principle, cease while something remains to witness its absence. This premise feels unavoidable because every experience you have ever had is organized temporally. But experience is not a reliable guide to structure. It is a local effect, not a universal property. Discomfort begins when you recognize that time is not a background container. It is not something the universe sits inside. Time is part of the universe's geometry. It is inseparable from space, from matter, from energy. Remove time, and you do not reveal a static universe beneath it. You remove the framework that allows anything to be ordered, compared, or said to occur at all. An end of time is not the last page of a story. It is the loss of the concept of pages. At this point, intuition tries to rescue itself by imagining an external vantage point. You picture the universe from the outside, as if someone could observe time running out. But the universe does not permit an outside perspective. There is no external clock ticking against which cosmic time could be measured. Any description of ending already assumes a temporal sequence in which the ending takes place. This is not a technical oversight. It is a structural contradiction. The contradiction sharpens when you consider what after would mean if time ended. After is a temporal relation. It requires time to exist. Asking what happens after time ends is not an unanswered question. It is an ill-formed one. The universe does not refuse to answer it. It dissolves it. The moment time ends, so does the meaning of sequence, duration, and change. Nothing follows, not because nothing exists, but because following is no longer defined. You may still imagine time as something that could slow down to zero, gradually halting. This image persists because it preserves continuity. But slowing requires comparison between durations. Halting requires a final duration. Both rely on time already functioning. Time cannot approach its own absence the way a process approaches completion. The end of time is not a state within time. It is a boundary beyond which time-based description no longer applies. The deeper mechanism begins to emerge when you abandon the idea that time flows. Time does not move. Events are ordered within a structure that allows ordering. When that structure changes, the ordering changes. When the structure no longer supports ordering, the concept of passage disappears. The universe does not experience time running out. Experience itself depends on time. Without time, there is no perspective from which running out could be registered. This is where intuition fails most dramatically. You expect the end of time to be dramatic, catastrophic, final. But drama requires sequence. Finality requires comparison with what came before. The end of time is not dramatic because nothing transitions into it. It is not final because finality presupposes continuation beyond which something is final. The universe does not stage an ending. It reaches a boundary of description. This boundary is not hypothetical. It appears in serious descriptions of cosmology. Certain models allow the universe to reach conditions where time, as a dimension that orders events, ceases to behave as such. Not because clocks break, but because space-time itself no longer supports the distinction between one moment and another. At that boundary, physics does not predict a last event. It predicts the failure of eventhood. The unavoidable conclusion begins to take shape. When time ends, nothing happens. Not in the sense of emptiness, but in the sense that happening requires time. The universe does not continue without time. It does not stop with time. It becomes a structure in which the language of continuation and stopping no longer applies. This is not annihilation. It is the removal of the condition under which annihilation could be described. Once this is understood, the terror changes character. It is no longer about extinction or silence. It is about confronting a universe that does not guarantee that its most basic organizing principle persists indefinitely. Time is not eternal by default. It exists only where the structure of the universe allows it. When that allowance ends, so does every intuition built upon it. If the end of time is not a moment you could ever reach or observe, but a boundary where observation itself loses meaning, what exactly are you imagining when you picture time ending? The initial conclusion feels abstract, but intuition does not surrender so easily. Even after accepting that time is not a flowing substance that can simply stop, you may still believe that its end must resemble something. A frozen universe, a final configuration, a last arrangement of matter persisting without change. This belief survives because it preserves the idea that existence can remain intact even when time is removed. The universe does not support this separation. Discomfort deepens when you realize that change is not something that happens in time as an optional feature. Change is what time measures. Remove time, and you do not get a static universe. You get no universe in the sense you recognize. Static implies persistence. Persistence implies duration. Duration requires time. A timeless state is not a still frame. It is the absence of frames altogether. Nothing remains waiting in suspension because waiting is already a temporal concept. This exposes a contradiction that intuition struggles to resolve. You want to imagine the end of time as the universe reaching a final state and staying there forever. But forever is nothing more than extended time. You cannot remove time and keep its vocabulary. The universe does not allow you to subtract one dimension while preserving the meaning that depended on it. When time ends, the idea of remaining, persisting, or continuing collapses with it. At this point, intuition often shifts toward cosmology. You may imagine the universe collapsing back into itself or expanding so completely that interactions cease. These images feel concrete because they involve familiar processes. But these are descriptions of what happens within time, not of time ending. A collapse still has a sequence, an expansion still unfolds. The end of time is not a physical process like these. It is a condition in which processes are no longer defined as processes. The deeper mechanism becomes unavoidable when you consider that time is not an independent variable the universe can discard at will. It is woven into the structure that defines what can influence what. Cause, effect, and interaction all rely on temporal ordering. When the structure no longer supports that ordering, the idea of influence itself dissolves. Nothing causes the end of time. Causation requires time. The end of time is not an outcome. It is a boundary. This is why attempts to describe the end of time always smuggle time back in. You imagine clocks slowing, events stretching, moments growing farther apart. But these are temporal descriptions. They assume that time continues to exist while becoming extreme. The end of time is not an extreme version of time. It is the absence of the conditions that make extremity meaningful. Here, the universe reveals its indifference most clearly. It does not preserve concepts because they are useful. It preserves only what remains internally consistent. Time exists where space-time geometry allows it to function as an ordering dimension. Where that geometry changes, time changes. Where it no longer supports ordering, time does not survive as a concept. The universe does not mourn this loss. It does not register it. This realization forces another intuition to collapse. You believe that existence must always be something happening. That reality requires activity, but activity is already a temporal idea. The universe does not require happening to exist. It requires only structure. Where structure no longer includes time, existence does not become empty. It becomes indescribable in temporal terms. The unavoidable conclusion draws closer. The end of time is not an event you could ever experience. Experience requires succession. Memory requires sequence. Awareness requires duration. None of these survive the removal of time. There is no final observer witnessing the end. There is no silence afterward. There is no afterward. The universe does not end in darkness. It ends in the loss of the conditions that make ending meaningful. This is what makes the idea so unsettling. It does not offer a dramatic finale. It removes the possibility of one. Time does not die. It ceases to apply. The universe does not cross into timelessness. It reaches a boundary where your language, your intuition, and your expectations stop functioning. If the end of time cannot be described as a final state, a frozen universe, or a last moment, what exactly are you still assuming must remain when time itself is gone? What remains now is the last refuge of intuition. The belief that even if time ends, reality must still be complete in a way that can be imagined. You may accept that there is no after, no frozen universe, no final moment that lingers. Yet you still expect the end of time to be something the universe reaches, some condition that can be represented as a state. This expectation feels minimal. It is not. It is the final error. Discomfort deepens when you recognize that states themselves are temporal notions. A state implies comparison with other states. It implies persistence across an interval. Even describing a universe at the end of time already assumes a coordinate that no longer exists. You are not struggling to visualize something difficult. You are attempting to apply a category that has been removed. The universe does not provide a substitute. The contradiction becomes unavoidable here. You want to think of the end of time as a limit approached from within time, where descriptions remain valid up to the boundary and then simply stop. But boundaries of this kind are not like walls you can stand next to. They are points where the very notion of standing next to something ceases to be defined. You cannot approach the end of time any more than you can step outside space-time to observe it. Approach already assumes duration. The deeper mechanism reveals why this failure is fundamental rather than technical. Time is not an ingredient added to reality. It is the ordering principle that allows reality to be described as a sequence of events. When the geometry of the universe no longer supports that ordering, description does not become incomplete. It becomes inapplicable. This is not a missing theory. It is a limit imposed by consistency. At this depth, even the concept of existence becomes unstable in the way you normally use it. You equate existence with persistence, with being present over time. But persistence is a temporal relation. When time ends, existence cannot be defined in terms of endurance or continuation. This does not mean that reality disappears. It means that the way you equate existence with still being there no longer applies. This is where intuition resists most strongly. You feel that something must remain, some final configuration, some ultimate structure, but remaining presupposes time. You are demanding a timeless version of a temporal idea. The universe does not accommodate this demand. It does not replace time with another ordering principle that feels familiar. It simply removes ordering altogether, where ordering is no longer supported. The unsettling implication follows immediately. If time ends, the universe does not transition into a timeless state. Transition requires time. It does not enter eternity. Eternity is extended time. It does not settle into stillness. Stillness contrasts with motion, and contrast requires sequence. The end of time is not a destination. It is the absence of destinations. This is why the end of time cannot be experienced, recorded, or remembered. Experience requires change. Memory requires before and after. Record requires duration. None of these survive. There is no cosmic witness standing at the boundary. There is no final frame captured by the universe. The universe does not watch itself stop. Watching is already a temporal act. The unavoidable conclusion begins to solidify. When time ends, reality does not conclude, it does not vanish, it does not persist. It simply loses the property that allows conclusions, vanishing, and persistence to be meaningfully distinguished. The end of time is not catastrophic because catastrophe is a sequence. It is not peaceful because peace is a condition over time. It is neither. It is outside those distinctions. This is the point where intuition has nothing left to offer. Every attempt to imagine the end of time reintroduces time by stealth. Every picture, every narrative, every fear relies on concepts that only function while time exists. The universe does not correct this impulse. It ignores it. If the end of time removes not just events, but the very framework that allows anything to be called an event at all, what exactly are you still trying to picture when you think about time coming to an end? What remains now is the final misunderstanding, and it is the most deeply rooted. Even after accepting that the end of time is not an event, not a state, not a transition, you may still believe that reality must in some sense be unfinished without it. That a universe in which time can end must be incomplete, unresolved, or lacking closure. This belief does not come from physics, it comes from narrative instinct. You are accustomed to endings because you are a temporal system. The universe is not. Discomfort sharpens when you recognize that completeness does not require duration. A mathematical structure does not need to persist to be whole. A geometric object does not need time to be fully defined. Likewise, the universe does not require an infinite future to be complete. Completeness is not measured by how long something lasts, but by whether its structure is internally coherent. Time ending does not fracture coherence. It removes the condition under which duration was ever measured. This exposes the final contradiction intuition cannot resolve. You believe that reality must always be in progress, that without an ongoing temporal extension, existence somehow fails to be real. But progress is a temporal concept. It assumes a direction, a sequence, and an unfolding. The universe does not guarantee any of these beyond the domain where time applies. Where time ends, progress is not halted. It is undefined, and undefined is not the same as absent. The deeper mechanism becomes fully visible here. Time is not a universal feature that reality must carry forever. It is a relational property that exists only where space-time geometry supports ordering. When that geometry no longer does so, time does not need to be replaced. There is no missing component. The universe remains structurally complete without it. What disappears is not reality, but your method of tracking it. This is why the end of time does not threaten the universe. It threatens intuition. Intuition relies on sequence to assign meaning. It relies on continuation to assign existence. When these are removed, intuition has no framework left to operate. But the universe does not lose its framework. It loses only the feature that allowed it to be narrated as a sequence of moments. At this depth, even the word end becomes misleading. An end suggests termination relative to something that continues. Time does not end the way a process ends. It does not stop while something else goes on. It ceases to apply where the structure that defines application is no longer present. There is no remainder waiting beyond it, no timeless realm observing the conclusion, no final silence. Silence contrasts with sound, and contrast requires time. The terror you associate with the end of time is therefore misplaced. It is not the terror of annihilation, it is the terror of irrelevance. The irrelevance of the categories you rely on to orient yourself. The universe does not collapse when time ends. Your expectations do. Reality does not need time to justify itself. It needed time only to be experienced the way you experience it. Once this is understood, the idea that the end of time would destroy reality reveals its true meaning. It does not destroy reality. It destroys the assumption that reality must always be accessible to human description. The universe is not obligated to remain within the bounds of what can be imagined, remembered, or anticipated. It remains consistent even when those capacities fail. The unavoidable conclusion stands without drama. When time ends, nothing happens. Not because there is nothing, but because happening is no longer a valid concept. The universe does not finish. It does not freeze. It does not disappear. It simply no longer supports the dimension that made finishing, freezing, or disappearing meaningful. What remains is not emptiness, but a structure that does not admit temporal language. This is not a comforting conclusion. It is not meant to be. It is precise. The universe is not built to preserve your sense of reality. It is built to remain consistent with itself. Time exists where that consistency allows ordering. Where it does not, time is absent without consequence to the universe. If reality remains fully coherent even when time itself no longer applies, what does that imply about how much of reality was ever dependent on your experience of time to begin with?